Okay, so the Cnidarians are generally broken up into 4 classes, sometimes 5 classes. Traditionally, there had only been 3. So the original sort of 3 classes they were broken into were the Hydrozoa, Skyfazoa, and the Anthozoa. And then, you can see over here, and over time, the Cubizoa became a branch kind of within the Skyfazoa, and then their own particular class. So I'll talk about those a little bit. In addition, there are sometimes other groups of a different type of Hydrozoa. So there are a couple different variations of this, and there are different ways you might see the cladogram where actually the Hydrozoa are at the other end and the Anthozoa are pulled out down here. And I'll just talk about what characteristics we're using to kind of separate them out right now. But the main thing is just, what is each group? What is the dominant form for the life cycle, and if they have both forms. So those are the things to keep about. Do they have polyp and medusa? Which one is dominant? Is it the polyp or is it the medusa? And have they maybe potentially lost one of those forms? They actually have their only medusa or their only polyps, and they don't have the other form. So that's kind of the major things that we'll be identifying with each of the groups. And then they're all going to have different sorts of things about them. But those are the key takeaways or the key things to ask yourself when you look at a group. The Anthozoa, do they have both forms or just one? That's the main sort of thing they'll do. So come back to the life cycle before we get into the groups, just to kind of give you. Now, this is the general life cycle for a Skyfazoa. And these are actual classes. So we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Other times when we've been talking about groups, sometimes we've been using those specific terms. Other times we've been talking about some organisms as a clade is more the way in which they're discussed, because the taxonomy has been changing so much. Sometimes it isn't really worth spending a huge amount of time asking people to memorize specific names of groups that currently scientists are renaming and potentially may not even exist in the future. It's really more, if an organism has a certain group of characteristics, they're going to have those characteristics in the future. That is their characteristics. The name may change then slightly for that group or who they're related to, but they'll have those traits. And so that's kind of where our main focus is, on the organisms themselves. What are their characteristics? What do they do? How do they behave? How do they reproduce? How do they feed? That stuff's not going to change, all right? So that's kind of where our main focus is. So we have our medusa form of the Skyfazoans, and again, this is the group we usually refer to as the sea jellies. And so they can be fairly small organisms. So this is the medusa form, right? And the medusa can be tiny, or the medusa can be very large. I've seen some in person where the medusa is easily the span of my arms here, and the tentacles here hanging down, from the jelly. I measured with diving with a depth meter, at least 10 meters. They could be over 20 meters, so 30, 60 feet long of tentacles. Incredibly long. Sometimes frightening to be swimming near them, because you don't want to get tangled up in them because they're so large. Typically, it's the tentacles where they're having all the stinging cells, the nematocysts, so you really want to stay away from them. Sometimes if you touch, again, the top here, that you would not be stung because there are typically no nematocysts there. But stay away, typically from the tentacles. Medusa typically do develop gonads, and then they'll release sperm and egg. So gametes will be produced and released. The gametes then form a larvae. Among the Cnidarians, so whether we're talking about pretty much any of the groups, the Anthozoa, the Hydrozoa, the Skyfazoa, this little swimming ciliated larvae is called a planula larvae. It's very characteristic of all the groups. And the planula then forms a polyp. And from that polyp, then other things will happen. Okay, so now in this particular case, the polyp will asexually undergo a process called strobilation. So strobilation is essentially where the polyp will grow and it'll develop more characteristics. It will feed itself as well. But then there comes a point where then asexually the polyp will sort of divide itself into pieces. And then each individual piece breaks off. Initially, it's referred to as an ephyra, this little sort of young juvenile medusa. All right. And then it will continue to develop into a full adult medusa and then become reproductively mature, where then it will give rise to gametes to make more planula and continue the cycle. So for the Skyfazoa and the Cubizoa, it's medusa. I messed up and lost my eraser here. The medusa is the dominant form. What's the difference between a Skyfazoa and a Cubizoa? Well, the Cubizoans actually are, well, just on the name, sort of cube shaped. And instead of having tentacles all the way around in a ring, the tentacles are just at corners. So you kind of have 4 places where the tentacles are coming down. At each of those locations, and also we'll find these in the medusa of the Skyfazoans as well, are sensory structures called statocysts. So the statocyst has within it essentially a type of balance sensor. Which means while moving in the water column, if the animal is tilted sideways or was upside down, it can know because there's a little calcified structure that kind of hangs down. So gravity is kind of pulling it downward, and so it's say something like this. There's a little structure that hangs down, and it's weighted like that. And if the organism then tilts this way, let's say, and I just drew this opening here just for orientation, so you kind of have an orientation there. What will happen is the organism moves, sort of sideways. The statocyst then moves and, whoops, wrong color, comes in contact with the side wall because the organism itself has tilted. And that contact will then give a signal to the organism that maybe it wants to be tilted sideways because it's moving in a particular direction. Maybe it doesn't want to be tilted sideways, so it helps it correct itself and right itself. And so they do have this type of sensory structure. So I said these organisms do not have a brain, but they do have a nervous system. So they have a nervous system. And now you can also see they have sensors. The Cubizoa are also known for having a type of eye structure, right, with a lens and a retina, so that they can actually collect light and focus light, and most likely receive some kind of image. However, without a brain, the processing of an image of what they perceive and or how they use that information isn't really known. But they obviously can perceive light, and in addition, obviously, light coming at them from different directions can then be used to also sense an organism moving toward them. So they can essentially get the shadow as the organism blocks the light, seeing coming toward them in one direction, and they might change direction and how they move. Cubizoa can also swim very fast compared to the Skyfazoans. Skyfazoans typically aren't that fast in terms of how much speed they can generate, but the Cubizoans are. Which brings us to the next kind of thing I'll talk about. I said they do not have a muscular system. And there's a couple things that you need for movement, right? So for movement, you're going to need some kind of contractile cells, which are usually muscle cells, but in this case we said they don't have muscle cells, so they'd have, let's call them contractile cells, cells that can contract and change shape. And then you need something to contract against, right? So if they're just contracting and then there's nothing you're pulling on or pushing, then nothing happens. Right? So it's just sort of a random movement, and the organism doesn't go anywhere or do anything in particular. So there has to be a force exerted against something else. Generally, that's some type of skeletal system. I don't know why that won't work. Okay. But what kind of skeleton can they have? Now, this group, and pretty much all the other groups we're going to talk about it, really 98% of really, or roughly, I mean, that number might be slightly up, it's 90-some%, 99%, 96%, so it's a high 90% of pretty much all animals are invertebrate animals, right? Meaning they do not have vertebrae, they do not have a spinal column, they don't have the vertebrae themselves, they don't have a cranium, they don't have bones, all right, themselves. So when they have muscle and then they contract the muscle and then it has to work against something else, and in our bodies, the muscles are attached often to the bones, and as they contract, then they move, and then they're joints. And so how do these organisms actually move without a skeleton? Many of them are going to have some form of what we refer to as a hydrostatic skeleton, which essentially means they're going to have a chamber in their body, and in that chamber there will be water or some other liquid or fluid. And that chamber then doesn't change its volume. So when they then contract their muscles, that chamber is then receiving that pressure, and then it's going to spring back to its original form. And so that's going to be the counter kind of force to the contraction of the muscle or other contractile cells. And so in the Cnidarians, kind of have two things kind of serving this role, really. Remember I said in the jellies, the ones that are really going to swim around a lot. I need a different color here so we're not messing up with that. Okay, so remember they have this really thick mesoglea. Part of the role of that mesoglea is to provide something that the muscles can contract against. So the muscles contract and they try to compress that mesoglea, but it can't be compressed, so it's going to then spring back to its original shape. And so as the organism kind of pulls like an umbrella, some of its sides kind of down like this, then the mesoglea is going to then extend back up like this as they relax. And then that motion that is going to allow them to swim or propel themselves. In addition to that, and this is something that makes their feeding behavior a little more complex, their gastrodermal cavity can be involved as part of the hydrostatic skeleton. So, but essentially what this requires then for that to really work is that their mouth essentially has to be shut. So they open their mouth, water is drawn into this cavity. They shut it, and then as they contract as well, that cavity can be compressed against, and then it can spring back, to its form and to its shape. If the mouth is open, then all the liquid is just kind of forced out of it, and then nothing really happens as much. So it doesn't really help in the process. What that means is that they can't feed or take in anything new while they're swimming. They have to kind of stop moving and then move these tentacles, and bring the food up to their mouths, and then get them into the digestive cavity, and then they can continue to move around, right? And so that's going to be one of the problems. In addition to that, once they have food in their digestive cavity, difficult for them to take in more food because now enzymes are being released into the cavity that are starting to digest that food. So they open up the mouth again, they're going to lose the enzymes, they're going to lose some of the food before they get to absorb the nutrients. So often they have to go through a period of obtaining food, sitting there, digesting the food, then releasing the waste, and then they can move on and collect more food. So it's not a just continuous sort of non-stop process because it's not a continuous tube and not a continuous digestive tract. It's what we call an incomplete digestive system. Okay, so the medusa, dominant medusa form, the Skyfazoa, Cubizoa, we have talk a little bit about them. I mean, there's tons of additional things in an invertebrate zoology course, go into far more details. One of the other things about these groups here, the ones past the Hydrozoa, is that they often have some type of septa dividing up parts of the inner cavity as well. So some type of tissue that divides up the cavity, whereas the Hydrozoa typically do not. So there's some type of additional tissue that essentially adds to the complexity of the polyp and or the medusa form. in these organisms. So just something to kind of keep in mind. That's what that septa means. It's something that adds to the internal structural complexity. And it can create different chambers and all in different groups. Now, as we talk about the hydrozoans, so that's kind of everything I've just been talking about. Some of it applies to many of the groups of organisms, but a lot of it is really specific. We're talking about these two groups. Hydrozoans have a dominant polyp form. In addition to that, they are most often, not always, but most often colonial. So that means what happens is a type of reproduction occurs like this. They have a medusa form, but the medusa is reduced. It's very, very small. The medusa then can produce the gametes. They form a planula. They form a polyp. And so then we actually get a little polyp form organism. But then that polyp, in some cases, will either bud directly off the side or produce something called like a runner. And then from that runner, you then develop other, polyps. And so forth like this. Okay. So you have this structure here. In many cases, they'll share a common digestive cavity among all the different polyps. All right, so as more and more polyps form, you get, more mouths essentially feeding, but then they can all share food and nutrients. This becomes important because in the hydrozoans, you sometimes then get specialized polyps. So one polyp may then take on a new form, a form to develop into something different, something unique, something more defensive, or some other type of structure. And in that particular case, they may lose the ability to feed, right? Because they actually block off the mouth to be reshaped into something new. But then that particular polyp will then still get nutrients because it's sharing this sort of digestive pathway with the other polyps that are all part of the colony. What do they look like? Well, a variety of different sorts of things. Some of them do look sort of plant or algae-like, so they are often mistaken for plants or algae. And there are actually many times where I have collected, algae, and it turns out to be a hydrozoan, or I thought I got a hydrozoan and it actually just was an algae. Sometimes you really have to look at it under a microscope to actually see, are there little polyps or is it some type of marine algae? Many times you can tell in the field if you look at it in the ocean because sometimes the polyps are open and the polyps are moving, and so you can actually determine that. But other times when they're very small, it's difficult to actually tell. So they have this sort of very branching, almost plant-like structure to them that many of them can have. But there are some that have some very odd and unique structures. Some people are familiar with an organism called the Portuguese Manowar. And the Portuguese Manowar, people often mistake it for a Skyfazoa. They think it's a sea jelly because it floats, and there's a couple of these like that. So there seems to be this cavity, this sort of balloon-like structure that's floating on the surface of the water, and there's all these tentacles hanging down, and they think, oh, that's a sea jelly, or it's a Skyfazoa. But if you look at it really close, you'll find that this is actually just a float. It's hollow. There's nothing inside it except air. So it's actually a polyp that's been highly modified and filled with gas. And then so this gas-filled polyp ends up creating a float, and then all these little tentacles are just strings of many, 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 many polyps all along it. So it's a colony. It's a colonial hydrozoan with a float on it. And there's a few other types of groups like that have that structure modified into almost like a sail, so that the wind pushes them around, and there's a variety of different, very unique variations that they have. But the main thing is in here, the hydrozoa have a polyp and medusa form, but the polyp is the dominant form and the medusa is reduced in time and in also size. It's very small. The Skyfazoa and Cubizoa have polyp and medusa form, typically. But they're dominantly medusa form. They spend most of their lives in the medusa form, and the medusa form can become also very, very large. When we get to the last group I'll talk about here, it's called the Anthozoa. And in talking about them, I want to spend a little extra time. So I'm going to try to erase a few things so I just have a little extra space. Because the Anthozoans are going to be a group that will have only polyps. Okay, so there's no medusa. So the medusa is lost for this group. Right? So the polyps are going to be a little more complex. They have a little more complex polyp with more subdivisions internally and specialization. They can be solitary. So they're polyps only. So no medusa form. They can be solitary polyps or colonial. The solitary ones we're most familiar with are the ones we call the anemones. And there are some anemones that are colonial anemones as well, that they have many of them that just tend to be smaller. But the anemone then tends to be one very large polyp. And it then can produce its own gonads. It doesn't need a medusa. It will produce the gametes, and then it will release the gametes for fertilization, and then form new larvae, and then form new polyps. So there's no medusa form ever in their life cycle. They're just polyps. The colonial ones, again, the most common ones that most people are aware of are the corals. That's why I said I wanted to spend a little extra time on this. Corals become incredibly important organisms in that they actually create several of our marine ecosystems are created by the corals themselves. So corals have a property where they will create an endoskeleton. So they actually, inside the polyp, will form a skeleton of calcified material, right, that hardens. And so as they grow then into a variety of different forms, they actually have a hardened, calcified interior, right, as part of them. There's a living exterior. It's all living tissue on the outside. There's all polyps, kind of like this, like in the hydrozoan. It's a colony of polyps. They do kind of create these sorts of structures where they cover a surface and then they bud out essentially new polyps, and they're all connected to one another as essentially one organism that started from a single polyp, and then it just divided and divided and divided into hundreds or thousands and thousands of polyps, and those organisms then are creating a skeleton, and the skeletons from within the polyps can actually fuse together. So it's not just per polyp, so it's fused with other polyps. Now the living corals also generally have a symbiotic relationship with Zooxanthellae. So Zooxanthellae are algae that live within many of the coral polyps. The coral polyps can have pigments on their own, but many of the colors that we often see associated with them are either directly the result of the algae or the result of pigment molecules produced by the algae then that are taken up by the coral polyps. And so without the algae, they lose that color because the algae are gone. In addition to that, they may not have the molecules or products to produce any of those pigments themselves, so they appear bleached. Doesn't necessarily mean dead. They could still be alive, but many times they will die if they cannot regain Zooxanthellae. So again, we don't have a lot of time to cover this in this particular course because there's a lot of other things we're going to cover. But Zooxanthellae can be passed on. So this is a different life cycle here, but just the same idea that the planula from the larvae themselves can contain the Zooxanthellae. So actually the adult organism will actually package in some of the Zooxanthellae, right, with the egg, and then as fertilization takes place, then they sort of develop with those cells, and then you actually have then the polyps forming with zooxanthellae from the parent. Some can pick up these symbiotic algae from the environment as well, so they can come from two places. They could be maternally kind of passed along to them, or they can be picked up again from the environment. So it is possible then for an organism that has lost them. Why does that happen? Anyway, it's because the organisms themselves live in certain environments with certain temperatures and salinity. So a certain salt concentration. So if there's a lot of freshwater runoff into an area from storms or from human activity that's flushing water out into the oceans, that will have a negative impact on the organisms. It will stress them, and they may die, or they may lose their zooxanthellae. The zooxanthellae tend to be much more sensitive to temperature range. So they can only tolerate a certain temperature range. If the temperature goes with outside that, the animal itself can survive, but the zooxanthellae cannot. Same thing with salinities. They tend to have a much narrower tolerance for salinity ranges. So again, the animal could live in those in different environments, but the zooxanthellae cannot. So when they lose these zooxanthellae, they will often die. But what they would leave behind is the skeleton. So then we have these sort of white skeletal structures that are the dead coral. So when you see that, and people have a coral skeleton, say, here's a coral, it's like, no, that's like having just a skeleton and saying that's a person. It's like that's the skeleton of a living thing, but that's not the living thing. It's not what it actually looks like. There is a living organism that actually surrounds it and actually makes that structure. Those structures themselves, though, whether they are live or dead, then provide habitat for other organisms. The live ones are obviously much better, is that they're food for the other organisms. There are a lot of other things going on. There's photosynthesis going on and cycling of nutrients in the environment. So the living corals are doing a lot. But corals often then grow on top of other corals. And so earlier in the course, we said that it was actually Charles Darwin who was the first person to describe coral reef atolls and actually explain and propose how they actually developed, where the corals grow up in shallow waters because the zooxanthellae need light, right? But then as an island sinks over time, what happens is then those corals may die because the zooxanthellae don't get enough light, but then other corals will grow on top of their skeletons, and they'll keep kind of growing upward. And eventually over time, when the island is gone, there's kind of like a reef that's in a circle with a sort of a lagoon in the center, where the island actually was, and that's because the corals are just growing on top of the skeletons of other corals, on top of the skeletons of other corals, and they just kind of keep growing up and up over time, staying in that zone of light they need for photosynthesis. So the animal doesn't do photosynthesis, but they need the zooxanthellae to do it. So spent a little extra time talking about that, but that's sort of a unique thing. None of the other groups have that. It's just the Anthozoans, and it's not all the Anthozoans. It's just groups of reef-building corals. So there's other types of corals that are non-reef building. So not all corals build reefs. Some corals don't have any type of skeletal structure that they make that is reef building. They might have their own little internal sort of polyp type based skeleton, or they might have smaller. So there's fan corals that are just one individual. They never really fuse with others or build really massive structures. But the reef building corals can build incredibly massive structures over time with their skeletal systems. And so these little tiny polyp organisms can affect then thousands and thousands of other organisms because of habitat that they actually create for them. So they don't just live in a particular ecosystem. These organisms actually create a whole entire ecosystem.